First of all, Reverend Wallis, I want to tell you what an incredible inspiration you are to me. I've never felt so much hope myself since I stumbled on your book, God's Politics, in the bookstore and thought, that's interesting. Let's see what that's about. And then I joined Sojourners and so on. And since there's a short line, I sort of have two questions. One is about what seems to be the inevitable co-opting of religion for nationalism, because religion is such a feature of a person's identity, and that seems to translate into nationalism, and that seems to translate into one-upmanship, arrogance, conflict, and war. And the second question is about war. I've never understood, I still don't theologically, how any Christian can go to war when God has told us, thou shalt not kill. And I equally don't understand how we can avoid being exterminated if we don't. So can you help me understand these things?
Well, the first thing you said, I want to affirm the joining Sojourners part. We really want people to join with us and we think there's a movement afoot, and I hope you do sign up afterwards. We talk now to about 250,000 people a week around the country, and it really feels like a growing movement. In chapter 3 is the most theological chapter in the book, and it's about, basically it's called How to Change the World and Why, Rules of Engagement. It talks about, because it's not just true that we should change the world, that's true, but what does that mean? What's a theological approach that has integrity? And so one of the principles there, one of the 7 rules, is about take a global perspective. My wife's English, and soon after she came here, she asked me one day, don't they know that God bless America is not found anywhere in the Bible? It's right next to that verse. It says those who, God helps those who help themselves, I suppose. I think there is a real, I did a controversial piece about Iraq a while back, and it said, I think the issue here is not just evaluations of conditions for a just war, which was the rage before we went to war, but it was really, to whom do we belong? There's a fact the media never really reported, which was a majority of Christians and church leaders and church people around the world, a vast majority, and a vast majority of evangelicals around the world were opposed to the war in Iraq from the start. Vast majorities, even in countries like Britain, where they joined the coalition. Now, what do American Christians know that the rest of Christendom didn't know? Actually, we often know less than the rest of Christendom knows, that made us know that this was a war worth fighting. And as Rich Nathan, a Vineyard pastor, puts it in the book, he's not a pacifist, but he says he believes in the just war, the Augustinian notion of just war. Why is it that followers of the Prince of Peace are the easiest to convince to go to war? Shouldn't we be the hardest? Shouldn't we demand the most rigorous criteria? And you could also ask the question, why should we depend on our government leaders' evaluations on whether a war is a just war instead of our own moral compass and criteria? So these are questions we try to raise in the book, and I do have a section called Nonviolent Realism, and I want to stress the realism, because I do think we have been sometimes buffeted between alternatives that aren't really sufficient. I do think there is a kind of liberal pacifism that underestimates the reality and threat of evil in the world, real evil in the world. But then there's a mistake, which I call conservative combat, which thinks that you can easily smash evil with military power. And in fact, it doesn't always work that way. There are unintended consequences, and things break out someplace else. Sometimes you have to constrain, contain, surround, and undermine evil from within, not by attacking it from without. So I go through all this in some depth, but I think we need a different alternative than the just war and pacifist pulpits screaming at each other, but get down into the mud of conflict resolution. The real issue here is, how do you resolve the inevitable conflicts that human beings and nations are going to have? That's what this chapter is about. Mm-hmm.
First of all, I'd like to thank you, sir, for joining us at Georgetown tonight.
Thank you.
You mentioned some things about our level of division in this country, and I was curious what your opinion was on slavery, because in the mid-1850s there was great division in this country, great division even within the church, and I think that division is necessary sometimes to fight this evil that you say is present in the world. I was wondering if you thought the same sort of division would be acceptable with abortion, because, as we know, estimates are that millions of children, young children, have lost their lives because of abortion. And that's a very, very divisive issue in this country. Would you say that there's sometimes a time for division and a time not for division?
Well, there's always a time for clear conviction, and the slavery question was one of those. And I remember I just read a long essay just this week on Finney and his relationship to division in the churches and the issue of slavery. And he really wrestled with that question. He wanted to preach to everybody who'd come, but his strong stance on slavery sometimes dissuaded people from coming to hear his preaching, and he wrestled with that issue. I have a long chapter here. One of the 7 big choices is called Life and Dignity, Critical Choices. I'm a Bernardin disciple, Cardinal Bernardin. The consistent ethic of life, I think, is one of the best contributions of Catholic social teaching to our politics. I'm an evangelical convert to Catholic social teaching, and you'll find a lot of this book really mirrors the bishops on a number of things. But I like Bernardin's wider agenda, where all the assaults on human life are important to us. Darfur, abortion. I was at this Family Research Council, a meeting this fall, debating Richard Land. And the night before, CBS did a show interviewing Richard and I about the evangelical agenda. Then he did some polling that showed that poverty was now at the top of the list for evangelicals. And Richard said, is poverty more important than unborn lives? Did they talk to you? And the audience said, no. And I said, Richard, let's not pit unborn lives, unborn children, against poor children. This is the wrong battle. They're both in the category of the vulnerable. But this is the third rail of American politics. And we have had this legal, symbolic litmus test battle for years, and the abortion rate remains unchanged. So in the book I talk about some new efforts, even in the Congress, where a new consensus might be built about serious, dramatic reduction in the abortion rate, where pro-life and pro-choice people might come together and say, rather than just having this endless debate that won't ever be resolved legally, let's try to do things that really work. Supporting, I was in California at the book table one day, and this woman came up and said, my daughter is graduating from Harvard this spring. I thought she was telling me because I teach there part-time. I said, that's great. It's a great school. You should be proud. She said, well, I am, but you see, when I was pregnant with her, I was a low-income mom on food stamps and Medicaid, and if I didn't have food stamps or Medicaid, I would have aborted my daughter. And a tear comes down her cheek. She says, you tell people that. You tell people supporting low-income moms like me is one of the best ways to reduce the abortion rate. And I promised her I would. And so Congressman Ryan, Tim Ryan, Rosa DeLauro, others are really, and it hasn't gotten the kind of press I think it should. The Abortion Reduction Act now in the Congress, and one thing, EJ, I've said, whichever Democrat is nominated, I'm going to press the Democrat, whoever that is, to make abortion reduction a plank in the Democratic Party campaign this year in this election.